Since the abdication of Pope Benedict in 2013, globalism has found its new champion in his successor, Francis, who has never seen a geopolitical situation that could not be remedied by massive emigration to the West and the redistribution of its wealth to the rest of the world. This Pope, for the cause of woke, has now ventured to the East and is advocating for Japan to also become a destination for the billions upon billions of people that wish to move to countries with advanced economies, and in doing so, join the West in the great social experiment of the 21st century, multiculturalism, an invitation that it would seem the majority of Japanese, at least on social media, are very vocal in giving a pass on. As I produce this video, I'm currently in New York City. Earlier this month, I spent some time in Vancouver, and prior to that, I've spent several months in London. What's clear is that in all of these places, for good or ill, I'm not saying whether this is a good or bad thing, but for good or ill, people have been told for decades that immigration cannot be controlled, that demographic transformation of their countries and cities is inevitable, and that hyperdiversity and a population that has nothing in common with each other in terms of cultural norms, religious beliefs, and social traditions, well, that is a strength. They have been told the more divergent the people that are living within the same geographical area are, the better off that society will be. This experiment is being played out from Sydney to San Francisco, from Boston to Berlin, and from Los Angeles to London, and is a one-size-fits-all social experiment. Again, for good or ill, this is the course that the Western world has set itself upon. The results of this experiment seem to vary from place to place, with some places seeing more success than others. Many have noted, and I would agree from personal experience, that America seems to have a better ability to assimilate newcomers than, say, Europe or even Canada. But regardless of the pros and cons of mass immigration and the success that it has in some places and the failure in others, this massive social experiment is in fact a localized and a unicultural experiment. That is, multiculturalism is a singular cultural desire of what is collectively known currently as the Western world. And the one thing, despite all of the differences between the countries in the Western world, is the historical commonality of Christianity, whether that be Protestant or Catholic. And now, even today, in the post-Christian West, the social morals as they are derived from Christianity, of guilt, charity, compassion, among many others, have transferred themselves upon the newly emergent cult of radical social justice, if in a twisted and extremist form. But it is now the current pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church, Francis, that is a key figure in the promulgation of the goals and aims of corporate globalism via the socialism of radical social justice. Pope Francis has for years advocated for open borders in the West, urging Christians to overcome their fears of mass immigration and their fears of migrants in particular. He has urged the people of Europe to open their hearts and their nations to people that come from extremely different cultures and who hold very divergent values to themselves. While, of course, this is the right and prerogative of any spiritual leader to think in the abstract and esoteric, it would seem that Francis had not considered his words very wisely while on his recent trip to Japan on, in his opinion, their need to open their hearts and open their nation to refugees from around the world. While I myself am not Japanese, I have lived in the country for several years, and I can at least give my perspective in terms of why the Pope received such a poor reception when he urged Japan to open their borders. So what he said that angered so many Japanese was in a speech to a group of 900 mostly young people, including some Kurdish refugees. He said, "In a special way, I ask you to extend the hand of friendship to those who come here, often after great sufferings, seeking refuge in your country." He went on, "Indeed, a small group of refugees is present with us here, and your kindness to them will show that they are not strangers, not in the least, for you regard them as brothers and sisters." So prior to these statements urging Japan to open its borders to the world, the Pope was actually received quite warmly by the Japanese public. But as the Pope began to preach to the Japanese that they should adopt the one-size-fits-all globalist experiment in multiculturalism and demographic transformation via mass immigration, well, the response to Francis, at least on social media, turned decidedly negative. "Do that first in the Vatican," wrote one Japanese Twitter user, which was liked by 15,000 people and retweeted almost 5,000 times. And this was from a very small account with less than 180 followers. The words impossible or absolutely impossible were prominent in many, many, many tweets on this subject. "That wish we cannot accept. Impossible," tweeted Kazuo Ishikawa, a policy analyst and former government official. And among many other tweets, I think it was this tweet by @NoProblem666 that properly diagnoses the failure of Pope Francis to understand that Japan is not Western, nor does it hold the same cultural values rooted in Christianity as the post-Christian West does currently. The tweet read, "I'm sorry, we've seen how European countries have failed terribly. Even so, why do you say that? First of all, we are not a country where Christians are dominant. Would you please ask other Christian countries, such as America, or America, or America?" Now, a couple of important things. In Japan, America is basically the default or the stand-in for all things Western. I'm assuming this comes from the occupation of the country after the Second World War. And secondly, Japan is indeed not only its own society and civilization, but in fact has a very unique culture that has a very different view of the world and their place in it. It's also very important to point out that the country is not dominated by Christian, nor is Christianity even a force within Japan. Also, for the most part, the country eschews organized religion for the most part, along with mysticism, in favor of cultural adherence to traditional spiritual practices. I'll say that again. The country favors cultural adherence to traditional spiritual practices. It is a culture that is not built upon guilt, but of shame. Shame of the individual and the family and the temporal actions that break social harmony, rather than that of spiritual or ideological belief systems. I can also say, just from personal experience, the idea of unlimited forgiveness as espoused in Christianity is a concept that pretty much everyone that I've ever talked to in the country doesn't seem to be able to get their head around. Charity for the outgroup is also an alien concept to most. When the Roman Pope is telling Japan to be a country with open borders based on values that they do not share with the West, it looks to your average Japanese that he is a man in a burning house, that house being the West, telling his neighbor, that being Japan, to set kindling around their own home. Or put another way, the Japanese are an extremely practical people, and because of this, many Westerners, again including the Pope it would seem, aren't able to understand that most Japanese aren't able to just unsee or disregard patterns, and that's because human beings are pattern recognition machines. And non-Westerners, and in the Orient in particular, cannot so easily turn off their senses, turn off their intuition, turn off their accrued knowledge and lived experiences using either religious belief or ideological dogma in the same way that many, if not the majority, in the West are able to do. In the Orient, people believe with their eyes and ears rather than the conclusions of utopian ideologies. What should be gleaned so far in this presentation is that Japan is very different from the Western world, and a professed understanding of the unique nature of their culture and their wish to defend it While in the post-Christian West, even the slightest sentiments of cultural chauvinism are in the current year seen as pure, unadulterated hate, and for the most part evil, in the Orient, being culturally chauvinistic is seen as common sense. That being said, an interesting comment I saw on 2channel, which is the original image board that both 4 and the later ripoff 8chan are modeled after, was pointing out the irony of the current Pope and his globalist woke views. The comment went along the lines of the papacy probably not even existing in the current year, if not for the defenders at the gates of Vienna in 1683, and that if Pope Francis had been around and in power at that time, he probably would have invited the Ottomans to build a mosque within the walls of the Vatican. Ironic, if not hilarious. But none of this is to say that Japan is isolationist in nature or does not welcome intercultural communication and the sharing of ideas and the cross-pollination that occurs in the modern world between nations, nor is it to say that it is a closed society to foreigners that wish to come and work and live. But it is a paradoxical nation at the same time, fascinated with the other, but also defensive of their own uniqueness. They are the best example of a nation that embraces globalism, but in contrast to the Occident, picks and chooses what they will take and what they will discard. I think a very good example of the difference between the Occident and the Orient is to contrast the religious leaders Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama. Pope Francis believes that open borders and mass migration to the West is the answer to all of the woes that ail the planet, while His Holiness the Dalai Lama believes that people should be helped in their time of need, but when the time comes for them to return to their homes, they should return and rebuild their homelands. The Dalai Lama has also said that Europe must remain European and not become Islamic, and it's not a coincidence that he has lost all media attention since he has said these things. Neither the Occident currently undergoing its civilizational experiment nor the Orient wanting to retain their cultural identity is right or wrong. Outcomes will of course be divergent, but change is a constant in the human experience. Both are managing that change in their own way. Ironically enough, there's now a tiny minority, very tiny minority, now in Japan that is not only bewildering its fellow countrymen as it apes the actions of the woke left in the West, but according to the Washington Post, that after seeing the flood of negative comments, a group of volunteers that supports asylum seekers in Japan have called on Twitter to act. The account Free Ushiku tweeted, "Tweets that would inflame refugee phobia." Refugee phobia is a made-up word, by the way. "And xenophobia are growing. Twitter Japan should deal with it as it is on their platform and is being used to inflame xenophobia." Thus, what they have learned from the legions of woke in the West is that when you cannot win an argument about social policy or the course that society has set itself upon, resort to calls of censorship. It is funny how the woke, how the people demanding social justice, how the people demanding inclusion are always the first people demanding those that they disagree with have their voices removed. So that's it. That's the end. Thanks very much for watching. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing. Also follow Black Pigeon on the usual social media. Also remember to check out BitChute. Given the current climate of censorship on big tech that's only getting worse in the lead up to 2020, that might be the home for not only Black Pigeon, but an assortment of your favorite content creators. Again, thanks very much and see you next time. Bye-bye.